A little bit now about topography and color. Topography being the use of type, and color, obviously um, the color that we use both in our architecture and also in our backgrounds and contrasting elements that we bring into it and our descriptive graphics. And so we'll start with this idea of topography, and this really should be about topography and color and technology. I'm really not trying to make this a full education on the use of type, really just to help you kind of navigate your way, especially through the BIM modeling software, the ways that you can manipulate topography to your benefit and some kind of, I guess, rough guidelines. So the Revit, just like all software today, provides you with a host of font choices. And so font, if you're not familiar with it, is the style, the form of the letter that creates the words that you create. The default is Arial, and Arial is really very close to a term, I'm going to say Helvetica, a style of font, and I want to kind of spend a little time talking about that. So once again, we've already gone through this type display, but let's just talk a little bit about some of the specifics about kind of architectural fonts that we would use. One of them is this idea of serif and sans serif fonts. If we look back to these fonts, you'll see that some of these fonts are sans serif. They have no little elements coming off of them. And then you look down, like any kind of, how can I say it, enhancements to the style of the font. And then down here we have Latin, where we have a serif to it, this kind of like articulation of the end of the font. So here we have a serif. And a sans serif font. And I'm going to encourage you really to think in the world of sans serif fonts for your kind of architectural topography palette. And that really has more of a historical and common usage in our kind of professional communications. You'll notice the fonts that I use for our slide presentations. This is a very thin kind of sans serif font. It's really kind of one of the closest to a nice Helvetica that I've been able to find. And so this idea of a Helvetica is really kind of a joke. Did you know you can put whatever you want in a poster and it'll still look good if you use Helvetica? So I guess one of the first things about this idea of using Helvetica is this idea of simplicity. It's a go-to style of font. And when you start experimenting with other kinds of fonts, many times you'll start to get into, I guess, visual issues that you may have not anticipated. So you pick a font that looks cool, and when you start to write out a paragraph or start to make a title with it, you'll find that it doesn't really give you that kind of desired effect. So, like I said, I don't want this to be a whole lecture or really an education on topography. I've done a lot of graphics in my life, but I'm really no expert on topography. And I think a lot of other instructors here are much better at this idea of understanding topography. But there are a few things you should know, I guess, for sake of just getting introduced to it and using it in the software. Fonts have a weight to them. So here's an example of, let's say, a Helvetica font, and it can be a Helvetica thin, or it could be a Helvetica heavy. And the idea is this isn't just like bolding of one thing. This is the weight of the letter as it's written out. And typically, I would say we would lend more to the lighter fonts. They tend to look better and more professional on the paper. And they have a kind of a graphic ease, a visibility ease to them. And so, and as example, the slideshow here is actually a very light font used. And in this case, one of the other things is this idea of I'm using a white font on a black background. So the idea of weight is even more significant. Another term, so we have font weight. Another term we have is font kerning. Kerning is the spacing between the letters. So if we look at Indianapolis here, you'll notice that at the bottom, Indianapolis really spread out, almost hard to see the whole word. You see Indian and you see Polis. You really don't see Indianapolis until they've really been kind of pulled together nicely. And they could be overkerned, which would be like the second one down. where they're really so tight together that you're starting to have a little confusion about whether there's an independent letter there or not. So this idea of the space between the letters is really not a choice we get in our BIM software, but we do have a lot of choice when we go into Illustrator with this idea of spacing. I just want to get you sensitive to this right away. Like I said, font weight, font kerning are kind of two critical pieces of knowledge when dealing with font. So that doesn't exhaust all my knowledge, but it comes close to it about fonts. I want to talk a little bit about color. Once again, this is really kind of on the technology of how we interface with it on the software. We'll hopefully do a little bit about this, but I want you to be aware that our BIM modeler Revit has a lot of options in the ability to control color. And this can come in really handy when we're trying to do board layouts where we're really sensitive to the idea of trying to keep our color palette consistent. So we have this idea of RGB color. So red, green, and blue, that's an additive color system. And the number can go up to a maximum of 256. So if all of the RGB, I'm pointing right here to this larger center screen, if all of the numbers were 256, the color would be white. If they were all 0, the color would be black. If it was to be totally red, it would be 256 red and 0 green and 0 blue. So we can change the color of our sky, we can change the color of our horizon, and we can change the color of our ground color. And right away we know that that gives us a whole lot of options with the layout of our board, because we can make the sky the total color of the layout of the board, as we've done in one of our modules. And I want you to be aware of the importance of color. Color is, I said this has additional content in M5, so we're going to cover this again, but be aware that there's a color marketing group. Every year they determine what are going to be the kind of color schemes for the year. They help to project things with color use in clothing and paints, all kinds of things that will affect us as designers, especially interior designers, but even in the selection of materials in all kinds of graphics. So here's an example of something we're already doing similar in our layout boards. You can imagine being inside of Revit and making this bottom graphic here, and then making a really careful and considered choice about this kind of bluish gray here, with the idea that it wants to be complementary of what else is going to be happening on your board or sheet layout. So, and in this case, remembering back to the fact that we can adjust all of those colors very accurately inside of Revit. Also notice the sans serif thin font here and how elegant that looks on that layout sheet. So here another example of just why color is important, why actually the careful use of color is important. I thought this was just a really nice graphic. We have a lot of white space up here, and we've used color very carefully. So you'll notice we have this kind of golden color here in the center section of our building, a feature element. Our eye goes right to it. It also is slightly highlighted in our floor plan up here. It's also used in the numbering or the indicators in this, looks like the directory of our building. And then another little bit of splice of color over here. But a lot of the palette is very neutral. So this is a very well thought out use of color in a layout of a board. And then just another example. Once again, the idea of connecting back that we could be developing section models of our building and then having it match with color layouts and backgrounds and other color elements in the architectural components that we could create, with the idea of bringing them back into a layout board. This is for you to watch. This is, it's called BIM After Dark. It's by the Revit kid. He's no longer a kid, but he really talks about all kinds of things you can do inside of Revit to create really attractive and professional layouts. So this is hyperlinked, so you could go steps to Sexier Revit and Google it, or you could click on this link and go right to it. And this is actually just going to take off, and I didn't mean to do that, so I'm going to just go on ahead. All right, so I'll pick up next in the next segment with this idea of rendering techniques and technology.